Hello everyone and welcome to TechCity Connect. This is our third panel on big data and ethics. I'm the organiser of this panel and I'll be handing over to our moderator Charles Radcliffe in just a minute. Just to keep a note on timekeeping, we'll be ending the webinar quarter to the hour, at which time we'll then head over to our digital hangout, but more on this later. So over to you, Charles.
Great, thank you, Hayley. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to TechCity Connect. This is a day of tech, art, and culture brought to you by Ditto, the B2B tech marketing practice. And you're listening to our panel discussion, Big Data and Ethics. With the world of big data comes big responsibilities. So first, some introductions. I'm Charles Radcliffe, and I have the great pleasure of moderating today's session. A little background on me. My father told me I would never make any money in technology, so I should do something more respectable with my life and be a lawyer instead. I very nearly followed his advice, but many years later, when running a data science company in London, I realized that everything I had learned on legal philosophy and ethics suddenly had become useful. What I realized, there was a growing need to temper the art of the possible in order to avoid crossing the creepy line. Since then, I've worked in large financial organizations in a senior innovation capacity. My roles included acting as head of technology for Deutsche Bank's innovation lab, EB Labs in London, and most recently as head of AI for Fidelity International. I now run a consulting practice helping organizations develop their strategy around data and AI. And in particular, I'm increasingly getting called on to ensure the right level of governance is introduced. If you're interested in digital ethics, you might be familiar with some of my work. I occasionally write for Forbes.com and launched a white paper in January this year on digital ethics, which you can find if you Google MIT Technology Review and Techlash. I'm delighted to be moderating our absolutely first-rate panel, who are Gillian Doyle, CEO and co-founder of Cerebrion, Peter Lankos, co-founder and CEO of X8, and Richard Robinson, Chief Commercial Officer at DPL. So good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be moderating today, and thank you for taking part in today's discussion and sharing your insights. So a quick note to the audience, this webinar is being recorded and you can enter any questions you have into the chat in the GoToWebinar side panel, unless you're watching the recording, in which case you just have to find us on LinkedIn. So a couple of words on introduction for each of our panel members. So Gillian Doyle, CEO and co-founder of Cerebrion. Gillian leads the company in its mission to revolutionize the debt industry. She has an intimate knowledge of the insolvency industry, having worked in the sector for several years in a variety of roles, including software developer, senior data analyst, and operations manager. And Gillian has a PhD in nanophysics from University College Dublin. So good morning, Gillian. Peter Lankos, co-founder and CEO of X8. Peter founded X8 Technology in 2015, along with Sonal Ratan. And prior to this, Peter spent 30 years working in the banking industry, split between New York and London, primarily for the markets business. During this time, he provided strong leadership through difficult times, including the credit crunch, Madoff, as well as various conduct and regulatory issues that were experienced in the banking industry during those days. Previous roles included being the Chief Operating Officer for the EMEA markets business, as well as the Chief Operating Officer for Corporate Institutional Digital at HSBC. He has also worked at firms including Bank of America, Wachovia, Lehman Brothers, and JP Morgan. Good morning, Peter.
Hiya.
And Richard Robinson, Chief Commercial Officer at DPL. Richard has spent over 20 years assisting companies in the building of brands and the development and implementation of innovative go-to-market strategies. He's led many strategic marketing initiatives across various business and technology areas. And currently, Richard is the Chief Commercial Officer at DPL, where he helps brands turn big data into big action through combining data science, behavioral science, and digital marketing to transform the way brands engage with customers. Richard has held leadership roles within the data, ad tech, digital and media sectors, including as VP at Cambridge Analytica Commercial, MD EMEA at Turn, and also Director at Google. Richard sits on the advisory boards of a number of companies and associations, including as an advisory board chair at the Data Marketing Association, the DMA, and is also a regular speaker at industry events and conferences. Good morning, Richard. So,
good morning.
Good morning. It's a great pleasure to be here and moderating today. And thank you to the three of you for taking part in today's discussion and sharing your insights. So to start with this morning, I'll give a short overview on the topic, and then invite each of the panelists to give insights into particular areas that they think is important. There will be time at the end for audience questions. So once again, if you do have any, please submit them into the question box provided. We'll sum up at the end with a couple of closing comments each. So to introduce this subject, I think it's important to start with a reference to GDPR. If we could just move on to the first slide, Haley, thank you. So if we start with GDPR, which I think most people will be familiar with as sort of the cornerstone of the regulatory regime here in Europe. But of course, GDPR is not the end of the story, and many firms frantically try to implement GDPR, and maybe some would admit slightly too late. But of course, the regulatory regime is changing. In 2019, the high-level expert group from the European Commission published some guidelines on ethical AI, and then in February this year, a white paper was published setting out Europe's course of legislation over the next few years. So we can just move on to the next slide. The three key principles that are being put forward in the forthcoming European legislation are that all activity in this space should be not just legal, but also ethical and robust. And I think it's really important that the European Union the European Commission have recognised that there's a big separation between that which is safe and that which is ethical. And I'll come on to that in a second. If we move on to the next slide, what I've done is just put together an overview of what's coming down the pipe. So GDPR is the first piece. In February this year, 4 papers were published. Europe's Digital Future in February, Europe's Data Strategy also in February. A consultation was begun on AI regulation, which closes next month, and also a report on the liability and safety of robots and IoT and machine learning was also published at the start of this year. What's in blue is coming over Q2, and the rest of it, as you can see, is coming over the next few years. And altogether, this is going to make Europe a very interesting jurisdiction to do business and be in the data and technology space. If we just move on to the next slide, I'll explain that governance is obviously a necessary pillar to anyone's strategy for data and AI. It should sit, in my view, equally alongside the build out of capability, as well as the focus on your ability to execute, the focus on demand, talent and ecosystem. If we look quickly at governance, and moving on to the next slide, I believe there's really 6 questions that organizations need to think about when thinking about this, and these broadly break into 3 themes. One theme looking at the regulatory landscape and the extent to which your firm might be involved in the public policy discussion conversation. The second theme really looking at the risk management, and I think a basic level here is that organizations need to have an inventory of their models in order to be able to perform that risk assessment. And right now, this is an optional thing, a best practice thing, but almost certainly going to be a mandatory thing in a couple of years' time. And then finally, the question is, do you consider ethics? And if you do, how do you consider that? And do you have mechanisms to manage this? And if we just move on to my final slide, if you can set out your ambition for each of these things and also look at where you are today, then you can very easily put a roadmap together for your organization and chart the course from here to there. And I think that's the imperative. If we just move on to the next slide, that's it. So I won't go through all of these boxes, but the text is there in the recording for people who want to refer back to it. And again, I just want to stress the importance between keeping each of these themes in check. That obviously regulatory compliance is essential, and in Europe there's going to be a lot to think about over the next few years. Organizations are also really focused on risk and safety questions like debiasing of data, like explainability of machine learning models. But we also have to think about the ethics, and the ethics piece is the bit that often gets conflated and often the bit that gets left behind. And coming back to what I said at the beginning, we've really got to keep an eye on not crossing that creepy line wherever possible. So I'm delighted to have an all-star panel in front of me today, and I'll be starting off really right in the middle of the data legislation from the European Commission. One of the key innovations in Europe's data strategy, which was published in February this year, was the idea of data altruism. And I'm going to hand over to Peter to take up that theme. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Charles. Hi, everybody. My name is Peter Lenkus. I'm the co-founder and CEO of X8, and we are a data privacy company. But today we're going to talk about the European data strategy, but specifically data altruism. So have 5 minutes to go through about 37 pages of regulation, so buckle up. This is, I know a lot of you from the briefing are into digital transformation and how you can grow your business digitally with data. So this is going to be a lot about that. So the overview of data altruism, if you will, is that it's how can you take, if you think about GDPR, as Charles mentioned, we spent a lot of time, at least back in my corporate days, of locking down data on the back of GDPR. So now what we're saying is now that that data is locked down, let's unlock it back up again and make some positive use out of it. And they talk about things like personalized services, greater insights, and a level playing field about SMEs, and hyper-personalization. So these are a lot of the terms you're going to hear, those personalized services for individuals based upon their data. Now, the problem is on this, they specifically call out how there's a very small amount of the big tech firms, all of our favorites, who are effectively hoarding data. So data, I don't want to compare it to toilet paper, but in a way, you have a lot of these big tech firms have a lot of data, and that is squeezing out people from becoming data-driven organizations because they don't have access to data. Of course, it's all centralized. Now, the vision, if you will, is to create this, think of it as a GDPR compliant data supermarket or a data RS. It's how can you take data and form this single European data space where people can use that data for, again, personalization and good reasons. So Haley, if you can smash me to the next slide. Now, hopefully some of these will sound familiar to you, but the types of things that they're talking about here, which I think is really interesting. First one is what I call green data, or the availability of data. The problem they have, right, data is an interesting asset in that it's not single consumable. You can reuse data a lot of times, and different people can use it. Especially, they call out a lot in the data altruism for AI. So you can take that data and lots of different people can use it. But as I said, you have the imbalances in the market power of data. And the fact that you have this data advantage of the big tech firms is squeezing out people, especially the SMEs, from developing new product because they don't have access to the data. Now, the next one, I like to say, you say tomato, I say tomato, but in reality, I do say tomato, you say tomato, but from a data perspective, it's more important. Even though we can say it differently, when it comes to data, you have to say it the same. So you need that interoperability. You need to call data attributes the same thing. Otherwise, you cannot have interoperability. And the commission is looking, how can they create the working groups to standardize the naming of data and the conventions around data. Next one, data governance. This is obviously a panel on big data and ethics. And the question is how can you scale the governance aspect of this across a very large data set and across this data supermarket? Next is the infrastructure and technology. This is, for those of you in financial services, I think you will recognize a lot of this. It has to do with the cloud usage. Now, cloud usage, they break out on the supply side and the demand side. On the supply side, they specifically call out the fact that the EU does not have a lot of data, a lot of cloud hosting providers, and a lot of the cloud services are based either in China or the US. And there's a lot of discussion around if you're putting your data on a cloud that is hosted, say, in China or the US, how do you deal with the ethical issues with respect to the data privacy? And you have things like the US Cloud Act where they can tap into your data, or the Chinese also have laws around they can tap into your data for national intelligence purposes. So this is something that they strongly consider. On the demand side, the flip of that is there's a very low cloud uptake in Europe. So only 1 in 4 companies and 1 in 5 for SMEs are using the cloud in a massive sort of way. If you look across all of the member states, you have from 10% to 65% adopting the cloud. So you don't have a strong cloud usage, which could become problematic, especially for things such as AI. Next up we have is for GDPR. GDPR is an interesting one. Charles mentioned it. This was quite transformative a few years ago. However, they're recognizing now that people, individuals like ourselves, don't have the tools to necessarily comply with GDPR. So where you want to make decisions about how to use your data, where to block it, how to consent, those tools do not freely exist. And those are something, if you want to unlock people's data, you need to give them the tools to manage their data. Skills and literacy is another big topic that people consider here. When you look at the big data and analytics space, there's about 500,000 unfilled positions, which is quite a lot. And also, when you look at the workforce as well as the individuals in EU, there's a very low data literacy. So in order to achieve data altruism, you have to grow that data literacy. And last but not least, we have cybersecurity. In the old way of doing things, data was contained in a data center. As we move out to Internet of Things and we're now expanding the data across the spectrum, and it's not consolidated in data centers anymore, and it is spread across the edge and everywhere. So now cybersecurity is going to have to change. In order to protect that data, that data is federated, you need to make sure it's protected across its entire journey. The last thing I'll leave you with, there's certain key themes that come up repetitively throughout the legislation, and those are AI, SMEs, data privacy, data sharing, leveling the playing field, and creating the value for individuals, the economy, and society. Charles, back to you.
That's great, Peter. Thank you very much for sharing that. I think it's really exciting what's happening in terms of the vision from the European Commission. But it takes me back to when GDPR was first enacted. I can never decide whether GDPR was 30 years too early or 30 years too late. And of course, we're going to strike a balance between getting the right regulation in place and helping protect consumers, and also being able to compete on the global stage. And I thought it was very interesting, the comparisons you drew there between the cloud uptake across different member states in the European Union, but also the fact that European cloud providers are quite weak compared to their US and Chinese counterparts. And it'd be interesting to see whether the Commission manages to address that. Do you have any thoughts on that, Peter?
I think they're going to have to, Charles. I don't think there's any way that the way that the world is moving towards the low cost, high power of the cloud, I think there will have to be a migration in that direction in order to achieve data altruism. However, that has to be done safely. And I think, again, tying into this panel, there are plenty of ways in this day and age that you can use the cloud safely. And I think you'll see more of those sort of techniques evolving to give people that power they require, but at the same time, following the guidance in the data privacy with respect to the rights of individuals.
And I've got a question for you, Gillian, on this. Obviously, this whole idea of data altruism, requires people to give up data for a greater purpose, a purpose that perhaps is more important than their own needs and challenges. In your line of business, you really rely on data in order to be able to get that early warning radar system up and running for potential insolvency, to provide people with help and advice and signposting. So, what's the sort of data that you think people ought to be encouraged to give to a greater cause?
Morning, Charles, and hello everybody that's joining us. Yeah, it's a really interesting point. From our side of the company, at the moment, we're typically only dealing with consumers' data at the point of insolvency, and effectively they have to hand over under law all of their financial, I suppose, well-being and what they're spending their money on, I guess, over the course of this debt arrangement. But after coming through COVID in the last couple of weeks, we've had to change our tech to be able to do this ahead of time, because as of a couple of weeks ago, no credit risk model works. And I think for the consumer, definitely there is a huge misunderstanding and lack of education in terms of what they're giving up and why they're being used. Even in our business, an insolvency arrangement, when it's presented to a consumer, is 70 pages long of legal speak. And I think that's one of the big challenges that the Commission needs to face, is actually the education in really normal, simple terms of what is considered personal data and when are you obliged to give it up. And I think it is obviously coming up a huge amount now, given the current crisis, about your choice and your ability and your permission to be able to hand it over. But for me, it is about optional. You know, it is an option to do this. And I think definitely if we can legislate for those options and the education as well at the end of it, because for us, anybody who's in financial distress is classed as vulnerable. And how do you ensure that people in a vulnerable state can actually make a decision to hand over their data?
Yeah, absolutely. I know one of the discussions the European Commission had when they were putting together the data strategy was around the language and the labeling being used. So one of the pieces of terminology that was flying around previously was this idea of data donation. But I think the concern the Commission had was that the idea of donating your data implies that you were giving up the rights to it for all time, and so they've chosen this term data altruism to kind of step back from this idea and the idea that users might still have some ownership rights on data that's given over the longer term. I'm curious, Richard, turning to you. I know you're not an expert on the European legislative proposals, but I'm curious, you know, how do you think that balance needs to be struck between you know, data that's given for use, maybe for societal benefit, and contact tracing is probably the perfect case study of that right at this moment, and also the requirements, this very European notion that ownership in data rests with the individual and something which can never, or maybe even should never, be revoked.
It's really interesting for me because I think there's already a juxtaposition in the current situation where we talk about data ownership residing with the citizen or the consumer. However, we've got, as you mentioned, we've got these very large technology companies that are sitting on huge amounts of data that consumers may or may not know that those companies have. I think that you know, in terms of, you know, sharing that data as a consumer, I think that there's a lot of mistrust in place at the moment. There's a misunderstanding about what data to share, how to share it. And certainly the contact tracing example that's just gone live in the Isle of Wight in the UK, that's going to be very interesting. And I know that the UK government's gone down a very different route of storing and using that data to other governments around the world. So that's going to be interesting. I also think there is this concept of how do you get the large technology companies to hand over data as well. So it's not just about me as a consumer sharing my data, it's also about those large companies. And having had the privilege of working with some of those very large companies and realizing that data is absolutely at the core of what they do, and it's a real competitive advantage, I think that there's going to be, you know, some hurdles to cross for the EU to get those companies to actually start to share that data. And on the kind of a third level, slightly separately, is that there's as you say, there's a whole raft of new regulation and legislation and guidelines coming through from the EU. But even today, there's conflict amongst EU nation states about how they've implemented the existing GDPR and relevant data regulations, how they're being pushed through. I know I read something just last week, I think it was, how the German government are somewhat frustrated the way the Irish government are dealing with the existing GDPR regulations. So I think this is you know, it's a great idea and it's a great vision, and I truly believe in trustworthy AI and everything that surrounds that and data sharing. But I think there's a lot of hurdles that both at a governmental and a business level, as well as a citizen level, to get this to fruition.
I absolutely agree, and I'm really pleased you've drawn the connection between that mistrust in technology generally, or the techlash as I refer to it as, and a contact tracing issue. And I think for me, I wrote an article about this question for Forbes yesterday. For me, the problem is that most of the debate is around the the technical aspects, managing the cybersecurity, managing privacy policies, also managing the question of whether the data is centralized or decentralized. And these are design choices, these are technical choices, and these choices are quite often the things which consumers don't really care about. And what they do care about is conversation. What they do care about is engagement. And that engagement, that conversation, that debate is the ethics piece, as opposed to the risk and robustness piece. And so that's why I believe all three need to be held in balance. We could spend all day going further into this, but sadly we don't have all day. There's too much else on the agenda for TechCity Connect. So I'd like to, at this point, hand over to Gillian, who would like to take us through some thoughts on the UK consumer insolvency issues and duty of care. Gillian.
Million, Charles. So from this kind of short speak, I suppose, is basically about when things completely change and you have regulation around, say, your credit risk models or whatever, and now these are all defunct. How do we actually ensure that the ethics are being driven alongside of our machine learning? Because effectively we are a data company. Even though I have a predominant workforce of developers, I still like to remind them that we are fundamentally a data company. We're B2B, but at the end of the day, it's the consumer that's massively impacted by this. And pre-COVID-19, I would have said to you that there's 11.5 million people with less than £100 savings. So you can imagine the wall of debt challenges that are coming for basically all creditors and anybody in the financial services that relates into retail. For us, though, I think talking about ethics and in context of big data, there's two major points here. And when it comes to assessing regulation and how is a company behaving in terms of the ethics in their big data, we're always driven by what I would consider a very summative type of drive. So we build our models and we get out a score. So is this, for us, is this person going to be able to continue paying their arrangement back? So when are they going to default? What's the timeline? And it's a proper score. And if you think about assessment and the philosophy of assessment, this is what's known as assessment in degree. And we're all very good at doing this, and regulation seems to be really, really strong about it. But the other side of this is that we're not assessing in what's known as kind. It's a philosophical theory, it's Deleuze and Guattari, and I think it's actually as equally as important, because if we assess in kind, it's a formative theory. And if we're only measuring the value of something based on a score or the metric, we're missing out a huge part at looking at our data. So for me, in terms of practical implementation, we have our model that runs, is this insolvency arrangement suitable for how long it is? But actually we've had to build out this separate piece, which is the formative, the assessment in kind. Who is this human being at the end of it? And what is their personal circumstances? And it's not so much as a score as an indicator. So for example, we would have our machine learning running to check. We've natural language processing that works out what's the literacy capability of the individual when they're filing for insolvency. Are they in an isolated postcode? What's the reason for their insolvency? Is there a huge amount of prescription medication or pharmacy bills in their transactions, their income and expenditure? If they're on benefits, what type of benefit are they on? Are they a carer? And for us, what we do is we basically give it a score of it's indicative that there's an additional vulnerability that exists in this consumer so that we can reroute it to a human. Because the machine learning, as the guys have rightly pointed out, is very, very hard to unpick. You can have basic models that run alongside and look for variations between both outputs. And particularly as you move to completely unsupervised, that becomes more and more challenging. So for us, the way we pick up the ethics side of it and the ethics in our big data is to have a separate system that looks to see, is there anything there that would indicate something about the consumer that would suggest that they may not be capable or have the ability to understand what they're signing up to. And for this is what we call the suitable. So is it the suitable arrangement? And I think by balancing both of those, it gives us a good opportunity to work out, do we have ethics at the core of it? And if you can just move on there, sorry, Hayley, please. Yeah. So if you think about it as, you know, I was a data scientist, stereotypical, definitely loved, just give me as much data as I possibly can for me to harvest and farm and model on. But actually, when you move into the role of being a CEO, you realize the impact on your business is beyond. There's so many external considerations for ethics. We walked away very early from a customer because it was easy revenue, but actually their business model didn't align to what we were trying to drive for in our industry. And I guess then it comes down to the internal. So if you look at us as just a small little company, it's effectively a small team in a large organization. But it really does come down to the practical implication at the employee and the person's level. Everybody's accountable. I can drive it, but actually, for instance, we were pre-COVID going to put our whole team onto an insolvency basic living standard so that it would drive empathy and understanding as to the type of consumers, even though we don't sell to them, what this really represents. And so for me, ethics is about balancing not only the summit of theory of it and the scores and the metrics that are driving, but also then the value and the understanding about the person that's actually in the end of this situation. So thanks a million. I'll hand it back to you, Charles.
Yeah, that's a wonderful note to end it on. I completely agree. I think, you know, ethics is absolutely about the empathetic and you know, the putting yourself into the other person's place, and you know, there's a theme in all, almost, I think it's a universal theme across Chinese and Judeo-Christian theology, which is, you know, do unto others as you would want to have done to yourself. You know, we all use different words, different language, but that theme resonates, I think, universally. I was particularly struck by, you know, your thought about the models that you're developing, and of course, you know, we're all familiar with you know, the challenges of the past in terms of credit models not being you know, granular enough. And I'm sort of, in my mind, I'm thinking about that Little Britain sketch where the computer always says no, and the infuriation that's built up in the user. But of course, with more granular models, with that richer understanding, there's always the risk that we are finding bias that in the data that we didn't intend, but we are in some way you know, discriminating against certain groups of people. And you obviously are working a lot in order to avoid that. Can you share maybe some tips with people on the call in terms of how best to start thinking about those sorts of issues, and how to, it's obviously not something you can perfect overnight, but, you know, at least where do you get started on that?
Yeah, it is. I think when you're looking at huge data sets, it's very difficult sometimes to unpick the interdependencies. A real straightforward example for us would be if you look at postcode when it comes to consumer insolvency. That's absolutely typically indicative of general income. So maybe they're on benefits versus they have a lower income wage salary stream. So it's about actually, when we start, really trying to test. And obviously there's lots of different models you can test to work out your interdependencies. And I think that's very important. And your data scientists are always going to drive that. But the real thing here as well is actually having people, when you're building a model, that understand the business and what it really impacts in. So for instance, who heads up our product delivery team is actually somebody that's not technical at all. But they're the one with all of the industry experience that actually, before these data sets are put together, we sit down and we discuss where exactly is the dependency living. And you'll find, particularly when it comes to insolvency, there's so many similar indicators that you need to actually separate them out and run them separately as models to work out, okay, are they all given the same one? So definitely it's about balancing at the start. And I think that thing of having a very simple model to work out, you know, effectively tech is replacing a human process that was previously carried out. So when you're starting, the closer you can get to that process in a technical manner and work through those changes. But obviously, the more you feed it, the more you get further away from it, even though it may become more accurate. It is very hard to do. But for us, it is about sense checking and making sure when we run our models, would this be something that a person in an insolvency firm would agree to, or a creditor would agree to? Would they have picked up on all of these things? So I think there's definitely a big balance between the human value piece and the human understanding piece, as well as just the machine learning models for working out, the maths to say these are all interdependent.
Yeah, and I think that idea of we're building machines to do things which humans previously did is something which we all need to keep in mind, particularly as that opportunity for human empathy is maybe taken out of the process. Back in the day when we needed financial assistance, we would have gone down to the bank manager and sat in front of them, and then the computer said no afterwards. And maybe the future needs to look a little bit more like the past. Where the algorithm is providing the signposting to the right people, but that human empathy is still in the loop.
I think that is that balance between the summative, which is your computer says no, and then that, as you say, the example of the bank manager who understands the person that's sitting in front of them. That's the formative side of the models that I don't think we've done very successfully over the last number of years.
Yeah, let's bring in Peter at this point, and also bring in a sort of transatlantic perspective on this. Peter, what's your take on how we bring the technology into the process, bring the data science into the process, but still retain the human touch? What have you seen from your side of the pond?
I think some of the points that Gillian said are absolutely important, where you can have that unintended bias based upon variables. And where I see the interesting conundrum here is that you have the data going into the models, which is very black and white, versus having that human filter on it. But I think the part I look at here is, as we're becoming more data driven, you are now relying upon having those attributes stored potentially outside of where they're safe. Where I talked about before, how data is no longer just in data centers, but is spread across the spectrum of varying computing points. And how do you protect that data? Because I think in a black and white world, if that, heaven forbid, that data is leaked, you're now going to have those attributes that could be linked back to an individual, but there might be those mitigating circumstances that the bank manager knows. But when you release that data into the wild, it could paint the wrong picture. That's why I think you have to look at these data attributes and ensure that they're protected from identifying that postcode that Gillian mentioned. You might want to do some sort of restriction. You might want to do some sort of banding. You have to think about what happens when all goes wrong, and that data now is not in the hands of Gillian's team, but in the hands of a bad guy. And that's where I think there has to be the balance between individuals and technology.
Yeah. What you're saying takes me to think about Edward Snowden's comments at Web Summit last year, and I was particularly struck by his perspective. He, coming back to GDPR again, he said that in his view the biggest flaw with GDPR was that it was focused on data protection. It was focused on on the sort of security of data once it's been collected, but not on data collection. And actually, the focus maybe ought to be on data collection and making sure that data that is being asked of us to volunteer for different products and services is legitimate for that use. And obviously, Richard, this is an area you've been grappling with firsthand, and I know you know very well, and also this balance of how to manage those factors and yet still deliver a great user experience and great personalization. Do you have any thoughts to share on Gillian's presentation?
Yes, very much so. And I think it was really reassuring to me of the language Gillian uses, not only around ethics, but also empathy, having a personal approach, and almost humanizing that decision-making process. Because the challenge that we have with, as has been highlighted, is data tends to be black or white, one way or the other. But there needs to be this kind of human element that's wrapped across, and that's certainly something that we're doing in our business. We're humanizing data-driven marketing. In terms of bringing that to life, I think that from an ethical perspective, I think maybe I'm just too kind-hearted, but I genuinely don't think there's very many individuals out there that aren't ethical in their stance and how they use data and what they want to do with it. I think the challenge comes when that ethical stance at an individual level is not replicated across a business, or isn't actually, there isn't the same definition of ethics across a business as well. So suddenly, if there isn't that one consistent approach, then that's where the challenges can come across in terms of the way that data is used or could potentially be used. But I feel that the concept of and I tend to agree with Snowden's point here. I wasn't aware that he made this, but there's a lot of emphasis on data security and less so on data privacy, if I'm being honest. And I think certainly in consumers' minds, they think very much as in a data security rather than a data privacy perspective. And the collection of data is incredibly important as well. And there's a lot of ways that companies are collecting data that some may feel is not particularly ethical and certainly not transparent. And that's something that I definitely think needs to be looked at, whether that's through regulation or industry guidelines, but something needs to be done around that.
Yeah, and I'm really pleased you mentioned this idea of we're all kind of ethical, and it's something which I think is a real challenge around labeling and certification. And I particularly I'm kind of worried about the idea of labeling products and services as being ethical, because to me that makes no sense. Humans are ethical because we are human. But the subset of us that aren't ethical, psychopaths, behave in ways which the rest of us find abhorrent. But machines are all psychopathic. Machines have no ability for processing empathy, and to label a machine as being ethical, following an ethical standard, I think is quite misleading to users and to consumers. I think what we need instead, coming back to my opening slides, is what we can do is we can rate organizations based on the quality of the governance. We can consider, have they thought of all of the factors? And if they have, then how deeply have they thought of those factors? And if we do those things, then we can say, we can compare apples and pears. We can say, that these companies are a high standard and these companies are a low standard, much in the way we do food standards and food hygiene back in the days when we could go to cafes, or the way we do it with car safety back in the days when we could buy new cars. Richard, this is a perfect time, I think, to hand over to you and to talk about personalization, because that's the other dimension to this whole story.
Thank you, Charles. Yeah, so personalization is actually at the heart of a lot of work that we do, but also in terms of the way that many brands operate as well. And I thought I'd start by just picking out this quote from McKinsey, which talks about personalization will be the prime driver for marketing success within 5 years. And how that is actually a little bit of a juxtaposition in terms of the way that some of the data regulations are in place today, where overall the idea is that the sovereignty of that data should sit with a citizen or with a consumer, whereas in reality today it still very much sits with a brand, and it's about how the brand is using that data. But personalization absolutely can be beneficial, in my view, both to consumers and also to brands themselves. However, it is very fraught with challenges. There's challenges around the types of data and the quality of data that organizations are using. Whether that's first-party data that sits within your own existing systems, your CRM system or your transactional system, your web analytics, that sort of thing. The combination of that with second-party data, which is becoming and will become increasingly difficult to use and utilize. The combination with third-party data, that's data that you've either bought or been shared with from another party. And again, GDPR has actually paid quite a heavy price on that part of the data sector as well. And then there's this concept of zero-party data that's come through, which is another way of just collecting data in a more transparent way from your consumers. So there's that whole concept of kind of how you collect data and where it comes from and the quality of that data, and also then connecting that across businesses, the siloed data within businesses as well. Personalization is also a little bit hamstrung by the regulations and compliance. We've spoken a little bit around GDPR and in the UK, the Data Protection Act of 2018, cookie regulations, consents, permissions, all of those wonderful things, and of course the concept of data security and what happens with breaches of data and things like that. And another thing that's going to really challenge, in my opinion, it's going to challenge businesses, certainly in the UK, in the coming years, is that the ICO's recently gone out to consultation on a new piece of regulation around direct marketing, which is going to have a hugely negative impact on brands that are looking to collect data and analyze data and use data in their engagement with their customers. Application and usage of the data is also a real challenge. I'm sure most of us are quite happy to receive an email with a special offer about something that we're interested in. We might be slightly less happy with when you call a call center to check on your mobile phone bill. They wish you a happy birthday because they've got a record of when your birthday is. But we're probably all significantly less happy about the way that certain applications are tracking our movements everywhere. I was somewhat surprised to receive an email from Google Maps fairly recently giving me an outline of all the trips that I'd made and all the places that I'd visited in the last 12 months. I'd obviously signed up to agree to that without realizing it. But again, it's that kind of information in the application. And then finally, I guess it's around consumer expectations, their frustrations, their desires. And, you know, on part of that, consumers are on one side wanting to be remembered with personalization. They want to go back to a website and have an experience that is focused very much around them and their history with that brand. But they also, on the flip side, want to have the right to be forgotten as well. So there's a real challenge there for brands on that personalization front. So if we move to the next slide, so I want to talk a little bit around some of the challenges between that balance of personalization and data privacy. And I think there's very much a kind of shock amongst consumers when headlines come out around how certain organizations have been collecting or using their data. I think this is partly down to a lack of understanding about the way certainly advertising and marketing works by consumers, the way that data has been collected, and that's a real challenge. But I'm also a consumer, and did I read the 34-page T's and C's when I bought my latest TV about how they're using the data they're collecting on me through the smart device? Absolutely not. And we're using, you know, all the social media platforms and the data that they're collecting. We spoke about that a little bit earlier. Other examples are, you know, that create that shock and challenges around around things such as this example here of Target in the US, where they sent marketing messages to a young woman who offering her baby products, and to the dismay of her father, who thought they were promoting for her to get pregnant. Little did he know that their data had actually told them that she was pregnant already. They've got a pregnancy predictor. So there's quite challenging things around that as well. But again, looking at it from a consumer perspective, I've seen research by IBM that states that 80% of consumers feel that companies don't recognize them as individuals, but they really want to be recognized as individuals. Some research by Salesforce showed that over half of consumers were somewhat likely to switch brands if the communication wasn't personalized. And McKinsey again have said that you know, somewhere between 5 and 15% additional revenue for those retailers that actually personalize their connections and communications with their customers. So personalization is good for consumers and it's good for businesses, but there's a real challenge there and a balance there between that data privacy and the optimization of adding value to consumers.
And I think that point about finding that optimization is critical. Your personalization is great for business and great to be able to offer services and products, but obviously not if it comes at the cost of a reputational hit that, you know, organizations like Target are unfortunately famous for. Richard, this is like my favorite subject, and I could literally talk all morning about this, and I would love to do so with you, but unfortunately we're running really out of time. And I know people have got a lot of questions on all of the slides that have been presented this morning. So I think this would be a great moment if we take that discussion across to the green room. So I don't know if we have time for a comment from each of the panelists, or we'll save that for the green room. So I just like to thank Gillian, Peter, and Richard for the contribution that they've made this morning. And also particularly to Mike and to Haley and the rest of the team at Ditto, who do a wonderful job of organising these events and have done a really superhuman job of bringing this event to market. To find out more about Ditto, of course, please visit ditto.tv. The session is recorded. A link to the video will be shared via email. And for more information and for a copy of today's slides, I know people have asked for that on the chat this morning, or to discuss more of the topics that's covered, then please get in touch with any of us on LinkedIn or reach Ditto at control@ditto.tv. You'll see on screen a link to the Hangout, which we're going to move across to now, and also to the other events on today. The official charity for TechCity Connect is Mind, a charity that ensures that no one has to face a mental health problem alone. TechCity Connect is a free event featuring people giving up their time, like us this morning, to share our knowledge and insights. Anything that you can donate would be highly appreciated and make a big difference. And once again, please visit ditto.tv/TCC straight after this webinar ends for a digital hangout with our panel, myself, the moderator, and other audience members. Till then, just to say thank you very much for your time this morning. Have a great day. Stay safe. Many thanks. Bye-bye.